interest right away was how do we support the other 77 cities to make sure that they get support, that they get technical assistance, and that they push forward with their plans. Last summer, we launched the collaborative in conjunction with 16 cities from around the country to help them work on their plans, really to push urban mobility forward. And Centennial, Colorado is one of those cities that is participating in our collaborative. We have quarterly meetings where we provide technical assistance. We have virtual meetings once a quarter as well. A very big part of this collaborative is open sourcing ideas, open sourcing results of projects, and sharing what's been happening in these communities so that as many cities can learn from them as possible. So I'm really excited to have Melanie here. Melanie has been driving the project in Centennial, Colorado, and is going to share with us their experience both around project and program design, as well as an evaluation of how things went, and then how they plan to move forward. So, Melanie, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome, thanks Russ. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to see how many people are signed in and are interested in learning about our pilot. For a little bit of background, we'll first talk about what Go Centennial was and how it operated, and then I'll talk a little bit about our results and then some of the lessons learned that we'd like other cities to know about as they're interested in launching first and last mile pilots. I'll reiterate that if you have questions throughout, please feel free to send those in through the chat box, and we'll get to those after this pretty quick presentation. So, getting right into it, Go Centennial was a public-private partnership, and the goal was really to help people get to and from the light rail station. Centennial, Colorado is a suburb of about 100,000 people. We're a relatively low-density suburb, but we are in the Denver metro area, and we're served by 3 light rail lines now at 1 light rail station. And there's not any fixed route bus that goes to and from the station. We have a call-in ride or a dial-a-ride service that can pick people up and take them to the light rail station, but it has some challenges. So the City of Centennial, in partnership with the Southeast Public Improvement Metropolitan District, which is a business improvement district, funded this pilot to help people get to and from the light rail. So it funded free Lyft line rides to and from the station. We also partnered with VIA. They're a nonprofit out of Boulder, and they provided a dedicated accessible vehicle that was wheelchair accessible so that people with mobility aids or other assistive devices could also make use of the pilot. People could book trips through the Go Denver app, which was being piloted last year. It let you put in an origin and a destination and showed you all of the different trip options to get there. It would show you trip travel times and the next, when the next Lyft car was expected to show up at your location. And then in addition to the smartphone app, we partnered with CH2M, who currently operates a call center for Centennial, and we helped train their representatives to be able to book rides over the phone so that people could use this service whether they had a smartphone or if they didn't have a credit card or if they had mobility limitations. So there were a lot of partners involved in both operations, in the actual service provision, and then in the trip planning and the trip booking. The service operated in a 3.75 square mile service area in Centennial. It was bordered by our major arterial roads and the interstate to make it pretty obvious where the cutoffs were. We operated in this service area because it's the same service area as the dial-a-ride that's currently operating, and we really wanted to be able to have an apples-to-apples comparison of this new service and the existing service. That's the same reason why we operated Monday through Friday, 5:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. Those are the same hours as the dial-a-ride service. Our pilot ran for 6 months, from August 2016 to February 2017, so we've recently wrapped up and have concluded our final report. Trips also, as I've mentioned, had to be going to or from the light rail station. Again, that was really to mimic the fare structure of the current dial-a-ride, which does have a fare but allows free transfers to and from the light rail station. In this, the difference between blue and yellow is just having an origin or a destination in respect to the light rail station. I mentioned that we had that accessible vehicle. One change that we made to that service was that we allowed it to go point to point anywhere in the service area. So people on that accessible vehicle didn't have to be going to or from the light rail station, and that was really to improve the utilization of that dedicated resource. So that's a bit of the background, and now we'll talk about some of the results that we saw from this 6-month pilot. These are our trips per month. You'll see August and February are a little bit lower. We actually operated for 2 weeks during those 2 months and not the full month, so that's why they're a little bit lower. The colors indicate how people were booking trips. Lyft did a lot of advertising, especially in December and January, so we saw their utilization go up. We also see the concierge in purple. Those are the trips that were booked over the phone. There was a little bit of fear before we launched that there would be a lot of call volume coming into the call center and that it could be overwhelming. Ultimately, at this scale, we found that that wasn't really the case, and we think that that's important for other cities to know also. The orange trips here were those that were booked on our Access. That was the dedicated accessible vehicle. You'll notice that there weren't a lot of trips booked on that Access vehicle, and we'll touch on that a little bit later in our lessons learned. We also found that the bulk of our rides were taken by commuters. We only operated Monday through Friday, but Tuesday and Thursday being the highest volume, and 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. And 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. being the highest trip times, as you might expect with a service that's going to and from the light rail station. We also found that a lot of our riders were new to both first and last mile and to the RIDESHARE. We asked how many people had used the current dial-a-ride service or had used Lyft or another RIDESHARE. 68% of our respondents said that they had never used our transit agency's dial-a-ride service, indicating that they were new to this first and last mile. And we also had about a third of our users say that they had never used Lyft before. We also, as I mentioned, asked about another RIDESHARE, and we had 60% of people say that they had never used another RIDESHARE. That seems very high to me, so it's possible that people didn't equate that with being Uber, and is something that we would want to change in our future surveys. But I still think it's really positive that about a third of our users were willing to download a new app and try this new service to help them get to and from the light rail station. We also found relatively easy user experience through both the Lyft and the Go Denver apps. We had about 66% of our respondents say it was easy or very easy or somewhat easy to use the app, but we did have about 10% of people say it was very difficult. There were some challenges, some bugs with the apps when we initially rolled out, and both of our technology partners actually made improvements and changes to their apps to make the trips easier to book. But still, 10% of people saying that it's very difficult is problematic, and we would want to look at some additional education, especially for those people who are new to the Lyft service. I mentioned earlier there was also some fear about a high call volume. We ultimately found that that wasn't really the case. In the first 2 weeks after the pilot launched, we did get a lot of people calling to see if there was if the service was operating in their area or how exactly to book a trip, but those calls fell off pretty quickly after the first 2 weeks. We had an average of about 8.5 calls per month, and for reference, our call center is currently handling about 2,100 calls per month, so we didn't find that this was overly burdensome on our call center. In terms of qualitative results, we've gotten national and international media attention. We've had over 50 organizations and cities across the country that have reached out to the I-Team to learn a little bit more about what we're doing and how they could launch something similar. And 10 of those were here in Colorado, so we're really excited about the dialogue and the conversation that this is starting along the Front Range, really to look at this in a more regional sense. In terms of fiscal results, Our project had $400,000 budgeted. That was half from the city and half from that Southeast Public Improvement Metropolitan District. Of that funding, we spent about $61,000 in the 6 months. $6,000 of that went to Lyft line rides. The VIA vehicle, that was our accessible vehicle, we paid hourly to ensure that they could be in the service area. Overall, it accounted for about 75% of our service provision funding. It was an absolutely essential piece of operating the pilot, and we would highly recommend that any city that's interested in doing a first and last mile partnership looks at how they will accommodate people who need that accessible service. But we also think that there is the potential to make better use of that dedicated resource at a larger scale than in this 4 square mile service area. We had a nominal increase to our contract with CH2M to handle the call center service, and then Conduent is the company that built the Go Denver app, and we worked with them to provide some additional data collection and analysis throughout the pilot. In total, our average Lyft line ride cost about $4.70, compared to the current dial-a-ride, which is operating at about $18 or $19 of subsidy per trip. The accessible vehicle is definitely something that we think could be better utilized. In addition to that funding, there was also some money that came out of the Innovation Teams grant. One of the things that's really important to note here is that the city of Centennial is a contract model city. We have 100,000 residents, but only 65 full-time employees, and most of our services are contracted out. For another city who doesn't operate that way, you probably wouldn't see some of these costs because those would be done by staff in-house. But we did add some additional funding to Conduent to help build the Go Centennial screens and registration into the app, and to do some initial prioritization for those Go Centennial trips to make sure that they came up obviously at the top. We paid for marketing and launch events, and also some flyers and postcards throughout the pilot. And then to Fair and Peers, that's what I was mentioning, the consultant fees. They did a lot of our data collection and analysis. They helped us to build an operations plan and an evaluation plan, and then to do that evaluation at the end of the pilot. And that brings us to our lessons learned. The first lesson is better integration with our transit agency. I mentioned that for this service, we operated in the same service area as the dial-a-ride. It was still operating during this time because we wanted to provide that apples-to-apples comparison. With that being completed and showing favorable results, we think that in the future it would be worthwhile to work more closely with RTD to understand how we could expand service rather than offer things that are duplicating what the transit agency is providing. We also think that there could be a little bit better coordination between the light rail schedules and when the Lyft cars are hailed or when they show up. The next lesson learned is to formalize the pickup and drop-off locations. This was something that we heard from both our drivers and our passengers. The Dry Creek Light Rail Station is interesting in that the only public right-of-way is on the second floor of a parking garage, and the entrance to the parking garage is about 10 feet from the on-ramp to a highway. So it was slightly challenging to find, and navigation got a little bit confusing. In our case, we're currently building a platform extension that will add a very clear kiss and ride, and that will resolve the issue in this instance, but we want to draw attention to it as something that other cities should be considering as they're implementing programs like this. The next lesson learned is to improve the back-end integration. I've mentioned that we had numerous different partners, and they had to integrate in multiple different ways. There's always room for improvement there, and we did do some iteration throughout our pilot, but we would recommend doing even more. The next lesson learned is to expand the duration, the service hours, and the service area. In regards to the duration, we launched a 6-month pilot, and I really would recommend the other cities look at something longer than that, hopefully a year or more. We found that it took us about 2 months to get enough data to build a trend to look at making improvements to the pilot. By the time we would have had those changes implemented, there would have been very little time that they were actually in place. So I think it's really important to consider how long the pilot will last and to help build those implementation or iteration steps into your calendar. In terms of service hours and service area, Centennial has a number of entertainment destinations that are near the light rail station but are challenging to walk to, and we think that going into later hours or weekends would allow more of that entertainment use. We also think looking at the service area, this was actually our biggest complaint, was that people felt the service area was too small. Especially right on the other side of the border, we got many complaints that on the other side of the street they were served by the RTD service and this new service, and that was frustrating for some of our residents. Increasing marketing is definitely something that probably could always be done. It touches a little bit on that expanded duration. With a 6-month pilot, we didn't put a lot of effort into the marketing up front. We did a lot of outreach events, but nothing sort of a concerted marketing campaign. And I think increased marketing would definitely help us get more ridership. One of the things that was also challenging about our time scale is that looking at 6 months, it didn't make sense to do any advertising on the trains or with RTD, and that is something that we would look at really as being very important for an ongoing service or a longer pilot. The next lesson learned is to improve user experience. I mentioned earlier that about 66% of our users found it easy or very easy to use, but also a lot of our users were new to RIDESHARE. The biggest challenge that we had with user experience was because of our coupon code, people had to select the Lyft line mode. If they used a traditional Lyft vehicle that wasn't carpooled, it wouldn't count towards our coupon code and they wouldn't get the ride for free. If you're new to Lyft or you've never used it, it can be confusing or maybe not even apparent that that's something you can do. And in most instances, we were able to walk somebody through doing it one time, and then they never had a problem with it again. So I think there's some education that could be done in terms of user experience, but we also want to put some impetus on our private providers to make sure that they're improving their app based on user feedback. The next lesson learned is to provide an accessible service. We think that's really, really important. In Centennial, so our accessible service I've mentioned cost about $45,000. It gave about 20 rides during the 6 months. And I think that's largely because there's not a lot of demand for that service in this service area because it's such a small service area. I think in the future we would recommend looking at the accessible vehicle on a much larger scale. Perhaps it could serve 3 or 4 of these service areas that are contiguous and still allow the Lyft line trips to operate in the service areas like the service areas work today. And those service areas are for the dial-a-ride trips operated by the transit agency. And then the next lesson learned is to address risks. When working with a private provider, there's always some risk there. We think it's really important to look at addressing these. Some of the challenges that didn't necessarily come up in Centennial were pushback from other organizations about using RIDESHARE. We didn't necessarily receive that pushback in Centennial. One of the things that was really important to us was to operate based on Lyft's business model. So we paid market rate for all of our fares, We wanted it to be really transferable to other cities and to work within Lyft's business model so that they could roll it out to other cities. One of the things that goes with that is looking at a potential change in their fare structure, and that's something that we would recommend, especially for a longer-term service. So with that, I'll recap the lessons learned. They were to integrate with RTD, our transit agency, to formalize pickup and drop-off locations, to improve the back-end integration, to expand the duration, service hours, and service area, to increase marketing, to improve the user experience, to provide an accessible service, and to address the risks. So in conclusion, we feel that Go Centennial was a really successful experiment in testing the demand and the potential costs for a first and last mile partnership with Lyft. While our ridership was a little bit lower than we hoped or maybe expected, we found a really positive cost model that I think makes sense on a more broad service area. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and I would be happy to turn it back over to Russ, who I think will be moderating questions.
Thank you very much, Melanie. We really appreciate it. That was great. We've got a number of questions in. I just want to send people a reminder. The chat box is in the lower left side of your screen. Please send us a question, and we will get it out to Melanie. So, Melanie, our first question is actually one of mine. So I'm going to kind of kick things off. And I was going to ask, because of the nature of your pilot, you're potentially only solving one side of a rider's first mile, last mile commuting challenge. Do you think that commuters need service at both ends to solve that challenge? And would there be a potential way to test that without expanding, say, to the whole Denver metro area?
Yeah, I definitely think it's really important that transit is accessible on both ends of the trip. We looked at it at a much smaller scale because Centennial only has one light rail station. We kind of, for this pilot, assumed that the majority of the trips, because Denver is such a hub and spoke system, we're going downtown, and that accessibility to destinations becomes much easier on that end. But in terms of testing it, I think there are a few things that we could do in the future, particularly by looking at large employers and maybe talking to them about which residents have easy access on the other end of the light rail station, and working with them to really build ridership even across people who don't necessarily have easy access at the other end.
Okay. So I have a question here from David Clark. David asks, how did Centennial segment out potential ridership groups before launch? And were certain groups targeted by Lyft or the city for ridership?
Yeah, so we didn't necessarily target specific people in terms of marketing. We did do some demand analysis, which was largely based on where people lived and where they worked, based on travel demand analysis in the region. Lyft did do some additional outreach to people who had already used Lyft in or around the service area to kind of show them that this was a new service that was going to be offered in the service area. The one thing we did specifically targeted was we did some additional marketing for the accessible vehicle to any businesses in the service area that served seniors or people with limited mobility. We passed out some additional information and more thorough instructions on exactly how to book a ride.
Interesting. And so I have another question from Elizabeth Collins. Do you think this same service template could be utilized with taxi companies?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the opportunities that we have now with these new trip planning apps that are starting to come out is we don't need to be specific to one service provider. There's no reason why you couldn't use this app and say one person books a Lyft vehicle, the next person books a taxi vehicle, the next person books an Uber vehicle, and it's all handled through this the same app and looks exactly the same to the users.
And Melanie, did you, during your test, I know you had a slide earlier about outreach from a lot of different communities, but did you have other ride-hailing or other private mobility providers reach out to you during the pilot that were interested in doing just that?
Yeah, we didn't actually have anybody reach out to us during the pilot. We were in conversations with some taxi companies before the pilot, but ultimately just didn't work out to have them as partners.
Okay. So I have a few questions here about the accessible vehicles. The first one that I have is from Charlene Douglas, who asks, what vehicles does the Dial-A-Ride use? And the second question is from Jim Dale that is asking, was that accessible vehicle used for trips when an accessible vehicle was not needed? So I'm just going to combine those into two.
Yeah. So the Call and Ride vehicle is a 12 to 14 passenger shuttle. It is accessible, although they don't track specific data on how many people are using it for an accessible ride. In terms of our bookings, because of the partners that we used, we weren't able to use the accessible vehicle for non-access trips, but I think that that is definitely a huge opportunity, especially given the fact that the vehicle was dedicated to the service area.
And then just a clarification, during the presentation you had mentioned that the RTD was also running their service concurrently in the area at the same time. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. So as a follow-up to that, given that there were two accessibility services basically running in the same area, were the drivers that were working for Lyft also picking up other fares on the side, or were they dedicated to this project?
They could pick up other fares, and since we were using Lyft Line, it is feasible that they could have even picked up fares that were not being charged to the city of Centennial.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I have a question here from, let's see, David Clark. When negotiating with Lyft, what kind of obligations or guarantees were sought on behalf of the city?
Yeah, so we didn't necessarily seek guarantees in terms of service levels the same way that a transit agency might. We did seek some guarantees on sort of the fact that Lyft would do outreach on their end to ensure that there were not an excessive number of trips that had surge pricing. So in order to resolve that issue, Lyft did a number of driver recruitment events in the area to make sure that they had people who were local to Centennial, who not only knew the area but were driving around in the area frequently to ensure that we had a high sort of volume of drivers in the area.
So that's interesting. So just building on that theme of kind of partnerships with Lyft, I have a number of questions about data and what data was made available to the city from Lyft. Jeff Phillips from SEPTA is asking about entering a data sharing agreement. Others are specifically asking about the reporting that they were giving back. So I'll roll that into a larger question of what was the data sharing agreement with Lyft like? What were the items that they were willing to share? And then lastly, what were the things that you didn't get that you learned either later on or that they were unwilling to give that you would have liked to have had to evaluate your project?
Yeah. So maybe that last question is the easiest one to answer. One of the things that we weren't able to get that we were excited about was the star rating for drivers, really to get a sense for how much, were people comfortable using the service. Ultimately, we didn't get that for privacy reasons, but I think that that's a really interesting data point. We did do a few surveys to ask about satisfaction, and we arrived at some numbers that way, but I think it would be interesting to know exactly what people think when they get out of the ride. In terms of our data agreement with Lyft, in our contract with them before the pilot, we did set out some data requirements. In that, we were really excited about sort of per trip origins and destinations. Ultimately, that's something that we didn't get. A lot of that was for privacy reasons. So we have sort of an aggregated look at origins and destinations, but not on that per trip level. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that would be really interesting. Not necessarily on the list. Go ahead.
One of the questions that we had was whether or not you got a percentage of repeat users or any other data point that indicated that this might have been habit forming for the riders and users.
Yeah, so we did get user data, and we found about 70% of our riders came back for a second trip. We found that the majority of the riders weren't using this for a daily trip, but most of them were using it maybe for a weekly trip or something that wasn't necessarily routine, but that they did on occasion.
All right, so I just want to switch topics a little bit. We've had a number of questions around the existing call and ride, dial a ride, and so I think what people would appreciate would be a little bit of a clarification of what service RTD was providing concurrently. Was it just for accessibility needs, or could it be used for other users who needed a ride to and from transit?
Yeah, so the dial-a-ride, while it operated, was for anybody who wanted to use it, and it would go point to point in the service area. The reason that we selected only to and from the light rail station was sort of a policy decision, as that was one of the goals of the pilot, but it was also sort of a financial decision in that the current dial-a-ride service has a fare, but if you're going to or from the light rail station, you get a free transfer. So there's no additional fee if you're going to or from the light rail station. So that's kind of why we made our trips free. We didn't want to create a new decision point for the user where they had to decide, oh, if I take the call and ride, it's free, but if I take this other service, it's, I don't know, $1 or $2. So that was a big part of that. In terms of ridership on that vehicle, it really didn't change much between the previous year and the period that this pilot was running. So we found that we increased trips to and from the light rail station by, I think it was about 4%.
Okay. So I did have this question of, do you think it's really comparable to the dial-a-ride service if it had to start at the train station?
Yeah, I think the service, I mean, the trip would be pretty much the same. The difference with the dial-a-ride or the call-and-ride, they're the same thing, would be with the call-and-ride, you either have to book at least 2 hours in advance or show up at their designated stop where they stop once every half hour.
Okay.
So the difference kind of being how you book them and how quickly they can show up to your destination.
Okay. And then just a clarification, because I think I was using two terms, but the dial-a-ride and the call-a-ride are the same service. We're just using...
Are the same service, yep. Call-and-ride is just the specific name our transit agency uses.
Okay. So I had a couple of requests here to go back through some of the funding slides, if that's possible, and just kind of clarify the costs for developing the app and who paid for what, if that's possible to just back up a little.
Yeah. So the app is kind of a separate conversation. The City and County of Denver awarded Xerox a 1-year pilot to do this travel planning app at no cost. And so that launched last February 2016. And so Centennial viewed that as a great opportunity to build in all of this service together. And so we worked with Conduent to build in a few additional registration screens and to help prioritize those Go Centennial trips. So we didn't necessarily pay for the app development. That was something that came around through a free pilot that the City and County of Denver was doing that we just kind of piggybacked on. In terms of the funding, everything on this slide, this $61,000, was funded either, so the city and a Metropolitan Improvement District put in 50% of the funding each. So this covered the actual service, providing the rides, and then doing the data analysis during the service.
So I have another question, which is I remember you saying earlier that you had budgeted something in the neighborhood of $400,000 for this whole project, and it looks like it came down considerably less than there. Can you identify what was the, I don't know, the gap, for lack of a better term, in what you thought it would be originally through your planning stages and what it ended up? What led to such a great disparity?
Yeah. There probably was a bit of optimism on our side in terms of forecasting, but one of our really key considerations was that we really didn't want to launch this service and then run out of funding. And, have spent 6 months getting to this point and then tell everybody that the service has to end. And we really couldn't find any strong research about the demand here. So while we were estimating demand, we made it a conscious effort to really think about the maximum demand that we might get, which is why our budgetary request was definitely higher than it needed to be.
Okay. So I have a few questions just on the kind of the quantitative side that some people ask. What was the total number of trips provided during the pilot?
1,302.
Okay. And what was the average distance of those rides?
I don't know the specific trip distance, but the service area is about 4 square miles. So the majority of those rides would have been less than 3 miles.
Okay. And then another question I had was Liftline already available in Denver, or were you, as part of your negotiation process with Lyft, was it to bring their carpooling line in?
It was already available here.
Okay. So let's see here. Michael Carroll from Columbus has a question about customers use the regular Lyft app to hail a car and then entered a coupon code to get the service for free. How was that charge then booked to Centennial?
Yeah, so we had a specific coupon code that you only had to enter once. You didn't necessarily have to do it every time you booked a trip. And then the city got a monthly invoice from Lyft with all of the trips from the previous month.
Okay. So my follow-up to that is about kind of digital and financial access. What were the methods that people could use if they didn't have a credit card or they didn't have a smartphone? So we know that they could call into the Dial-A-Ride service, but how about on the Lyft side of the operation? How could they pay if they didn't have a credit card or a smartphone?
Yeah, so our call center had an enterprise app that Lyft built to allow them to book rides. So anybody without a smartphone or without a credit card could call in to our call center. The call center would hail a Lyft vehicle and could tell the person everything the Lyft app would normally tell them, like the driver's name and the car type and license plate number and when it was expected to get there. So the call center could handle residents who didn't have a smartphone or who didn't have a credit card.
Okay. So we're going to have just a few more minutes for questions here. So if you have them, please send them in. Another one that we had was about surveys beforehand and about modes. So did the survey ask riders what mode they were using before the pilot was in place? Then is there data to suggest whether they changed their mode as a result of this program? And then the third part is, what are they doing now that the program's over?
Yeah. So that was one of the things that we were really strongly considering as we were creating the survey, was this very fine balance between asking for too much information and what we really want to know. So we didn't actually ask how they were currently accessing the light rail station. we did look at park and ride utilization, and the park and ride utilization increased here, but increased about 10 percentage points less than in the two neighboring park and rides. So we think that that might be associated with it. In terms of, let's see, the next question was about changing modes after. We are looking to Lyft to see if we can get some data about how many people are still taking rides to and from the light rail station, but I haven't seen any specific numbers on that yet.
Okay. Thinking about that, I have two questions kind of related to RTD. The first was, did Centennial or RTD have to drug test Lyft drivers, or did Centennial or RTD find a way around that regulation?
We did not. As far as I understand it, that regulation comes with federal funding, and because we didn't use federal funding, we're not subject to that regulation.
Okay. My next question about RTD is basically, Lori Lariba asked, how did RTD feel about Centennial privately providing transit-type service in their service area? Do they not have sole rights to the area? Do they have collective bargaining agreements with their drivers that felt infringed upon by Lyft drivers?
Yeah, we had been working with RTD throughout the entire pilot sort of conceptualization and implementation planning. Initially, we were potentially looking to them to be a larger partner, and they had a lot of other priorities last year with launching 5 new light rail lines. So we've been in communication with RTD. They're currently undertaking a first and last mile study to look at more broadly throughout their region what opportunities they can provide people, and we'll be playing a part in that for sure. And I am actually presenting to them next week to learn about all of the sort of results of the pilot. So they've been involved throughout the entire thing and are really excited about this as an opportunity to look at potentially expanding the services that they offer.
So that's a good kind of segue into another question, which is basically a request for you to comment on the scalability of this pilot into new areas. And I know one of the things that you had talked about is what were the different ways that you could scale this kind of project?
Yeah, I think it has a lot of opportunity for scalability. One of the really strong benefits of working with a technology partner like Lyft I didn't mention this before, but our accessible vehicle was on the Lyft platform. They turned on a separate mode called Lyft Access, and that's how you could hail the accessible vehicle. Sorry, I completely forgot where I was going with that. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I think it was just basically, what are the scaling possibilities? And I know,
Okay.
when I had talked before, it was really that there were 3 or 4 different potential plans that you thought may be viable for scaling to part or all of the metro area.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is the biggest opportunities that we have is working with these tech partners. We can really figure out when and where our resources are being utilized, which is something that RTD doesn't necessarily have data on. I mentioned they don't track how many people getting on the call-in ride require an accessible service. But if we knew where those rides were and could dispatch an accessible vehicle more quickly, more conveniently, I think there's a lot of opportunity there to reduce the overall costs. One of the things from this business model that I think would be really interesting to look at is we know that our accessible vehicle served 20 rides in this service area in 6 months. And so can we look at maybe it's 4 of these call-in ride service areas that can be served by 1 accessible vehicle. And perhaps we could allow the accessible vehicle to travel across all of those 4 service areas, giving people who need that vehicle even more accessibility than they have today, while also being able to get the vehicle to them sooner, and since we're not using an accessible vehicle for people who don't need it, are able to keep the rest of those costs a lot lower.
Okay, so I just want to remind everyone that we have just a few minutes left, so if you get your question in now, there's a good chance I'll ask it. Melanie, we've got another question around getting to the station in terms of like project design. Getting to the station to meet a train in time a concern, or does the light rail have frequent enough headways that it's not an issue?
Yeah, so light rail is pretty frequent, especially during peak periods. That was also one of the benefits of working with this trip planning app, is it could pull in the RTD schedule, and once real-time data is available for the trains, they'll pull that in too. So you could look at the app and you could tell it, I need to be downtown at this location by 2:45, and it could tell you, okay, then you'll need to get on the train that leaves at 1:30, and in order to get there, it'll take you 4 minutes on a Lyft, and the Lyft car is 5 minutes away, so you should call the Lyft at exactly 1:15, and it could give you a specific time to call the Lyft to make sure that you can make that train and be on time.
That's pretty awesome. All right, so we had a question about parking occupancy at the station and whether or not you noticed any change in availability or parking levels during the pilot.
Yeah, I don't know the specific number of parking spots, but it's somewhere in the 300-ish range. Our parking occupancy went up just a little bit during the period, about 2%, but the parking occupancy at 2 adjacent stations went up 12 to 15%. So we think there could be some potential impact there from Go Centennial.
Yeah, that's a pretty marked difference if you see a 12 to 13% increase at neighboring stations.
Yeah, and it was at both the station to the north and the station to the south.
Okay. All right, so the last couple of questions really are about what's next. How do you, what are the plans for the future? Are you considering another partnership with Lyft or another company? How do you plan to continue using these lessons that you've learned and applying them in Centennial?
Yeah, so I presented our final report to City Council in June, and they elected to form a subcommittee to look at what a transportation service might look like. I think from this presentation, it was clear to them that it didn't necessarily make sense to keep this program as an ongoing service, and that it would make sense to look at expanding the service hours, expanding the service area for one, and potentially looking at additional hours. So they're in a subcommittee right now to look at who the target audience and the target focus area are for an ongoing transportation service.
All right, we had one last minute question in here from Josh Gaub that says, is $4.50 a ride expensive for this service compared to public transportation?
The current call-in ride that's operating in this 4 square mile service area has a per trip subsidy of about $18. And so our goal was really to provide a service that could have a lower subsidy per trip than that. I think $4.50 was well within the range. We actually expected somewhere between $5 and $9 for trips of this length. So we were pretty happy with where the Lyft line costs came in. I think the key there is really identifying what it's replacing in the service area, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's an important comparison as well, both for the actual cost of subsidizing transit as well as dial-a-ride service or other costs, say, borne by a city that don't get travelers out of their cars, such as the cost of parking at light stations and ramps. So I think that's a good comparison. I just wanted to say thank you. We really appreciate you, Melanie, taking the time to walk through this program, to share it with Transportation for America and all the people online. We will have a recording of this up online. We'll also have the slides available for people to be able to review. As you registered for this, you'll get an email in the next day or two. But once again, we just want to say thank you. We really appreciate you sharing this with us.
Absolutely, and thanks so much to Transportation for America for hosting. I think it's been a great forum for us to learn about other cities' pilots, and it's even started a regional conversation here in Denver about trip planning apps and what we can do on first and last mile service. So thank you so much for hosting.
Well, thank you very much. We hope everyone has a great day and a good weekend. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll send an email in the next day or so with a summary and links to all the information.